Somewhere around 10,000 years before the Common Era, in a settlement along the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, a forager made a mistake. It was not a dramatic mistake, nobody got hurt, no tribe was wiped out. This person simply placed some freshly harvested wild barley into a clay pot, planning to process it in a few days, and then forgot about it. Days later, rainwater seeped into the pot. The barley sat in the water and began to sprout. The grains swelled, their starches breaking down into sugars. Then the weather turned hot. The liquid in the pot started to bubble. Wild yeast floating in the air found its way into the mixture and began to feed. When this forager finally remembered the pot, the liquid inside was no longer water. It had a strange, sweet smell. The surface was covered in foam. The color had changed to a cloudy golden brown. The forager picked up the pot and took a sip. It tasted nothing like anything they had ever consumed. Slightly sweet, slightly bitter, with an odd warmth in the throat. But a few minutes later, something else happened. Something nobody could have predicted. The forager's head felt lighter, the tension in their shoulders melted away. The world seemed softer, friendlier, more forgiving. They felt a rush of contentment that had nothing to do with food or shelter or safety. They felt joy. What nobody knew at that moment was that this one sip of cloudy, fermented liquid would rewrite the trajectory of human history. It would give birth to the first cities, inspire the invention of written language, fund the construction of pyramids, fuel armies across continents, spark scientific revolutions, and become the most consumed beverage on Earth after water. This accident would outlast every empire that tried to control it, survive every religion that tried to ban it, and thrive through every technological revolution that tried to replace it. That forgotten pot of barley didn't just create a drink, it created civilization. Let's be very clear about something. Beer was not invented, it was discovered. And it was discovered over and over again in different places by different people, because the process is almost inevitable. Whenever grain gets wet, sits in warmth, and is left alone long enough, fermentation happens. It is not magic. It is microbiology occurring 10,000 years before humans understood that microbes even existed. Here is what actually happens inside that pot. When barley or wheat is soaked in water and begins to sprout, enzymes inside the grain activate and start breaking down the starch into simple sugars. This process is called malting. If you then take those sugary grains, mash them in warm water, and leave the mixture exposed to air, wild yeast drifting through the environment will land in the liquid and begin to feast on those sugars. Yeast consumes sugar and produces two things, carbon dioxide and ethanol. The carbon dioxide creates bubbles and foam. The ethanol alters your consciousness. Ancient people had no idea what yeast was. They didn't know about enzymes or fermentation or chemical reactions, but they knew one undeniable fact. Drinking this liquid made them feel good, and they kept making it. But here is the part that nobody talks about. The real reason beer became essential to early human societies had nothing to do with getting drunk. It had everything to do with staying alive. Pay attention to this next detail, because it changes everything. In the Neolithic world, water was a gamble. Rivers, lakes, and wells were contaminated with parasites, bacteria, and pathogens that could kill you slowly or quickly, depending on what you drank. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid. These were not distant threats. They were everyday risks. Drinking untreated water was one of the leading causes of death in early agricultural communities. But beer was different. The process of making beer, boiling the grain mixture, fermenting it with alcohol, and the acidic environment created by fermentation killed almost every dangerous microorganism present in the water. The alcohol content, even if it was low, acted as a preservative and disinfectant. Beer was safer to drink than water, significantly safer. This was not a beverage. This was a survival technology. A liter of beer contained hundreds of calories of energy, B vitamins, proteins, and essential minerals that humans needed to survive.
Winter is approaching.
When crops failed, when meat was scarce, when winter stretched on too long, beer could keep a family alive. It was liquid bread, portable nutrition that didn't spoil for days or even weeks. Ancient beer was not the clear, fizzy liquid you pour from a bottle today. It was thick, cloudy, filled with grain sediment, and often consumed through a straw to filter out the chunks. It was more like a thin porridge than a refreshing drink, but it was packed with calories, and in a world where starvation was always one bad harvest away, calories were everything. Beer solved a problem that clean water and refrigeration would not address for another 10,000 years. It kept people hydrated without killing them. It kept them fed when food ran out. And it did one more thing that nobody planned for. It brought them together. Because beer was not something you made alone. Brewing required time, labor, and cooperation. You needed someone to harvest the grain, someone to prepare the malting, someone to tend the fire, someone to manage the fermentation. Beer was a communal process, and drinking it became a communal activity. Villages gathered around shared pots of beer. Decisions were made, alliances were formed. Celebrations happened. Grief was shared. Beer was not just nutrition. It was the social glue that held early human communities together. This was not about pleasure. Not yet. This was about survival. And it worked so well that within a few thousand years, beer would become the foundation of the world's first great civilizations. By the time the Sumerians built the first cities in southern Mesopotamia, beer was already ancient. But the Sumerians did something no one had done before. They institutionalized it, they wrote it into law, recorded it in accounting ledgers, and made it the backbone of their economy. Cuneiform tablets from around 3500 BCE list beer as a standard ration for workers, soldiers, and priests. If you were hauling mud bricks to build a ziggurat, you were paid in beer. If you were a scribe copying temple records, you were paid in beer. This wasn't luxury. This was infrastructure. The Sumerians didn't just have one type of beer. They had dozens. Black beer, red beer, sweet beer, filtered beer, temple archives from the city of Ur list beer. Inventories the same way a modern warehouse tracks shipments. And then there is the Epic of Gilgamesh, written around 2100 BCE, Enkidu. A wild man living with animals is brought to civilization by a temple prostitute. She gives him bread and beer. The text says Enkidu drank 7 jugs of beer. His heart grew light, his face glowed, and he sang out with joy. Then it says he became human, not metaphorically. The text literally describes beer as the thing that transforms a savage into a civilized person. The Sumerians even had a goddess of beer, Ninkasi. The hymn to Ninkasi, written around 1800 BCE, is extraordinary. On the surface, it is a praise poem, but read closely and it is actually a recipe. A step-by-step brewing manual disguised as religious verse, designed to be memorized and sung by brewers who couldn't read. When those workers were laying the foundations of humanity's earliest cities, beer was fueling every brick, every temple wall. If the Sumerians made beer essential, the Egyptians made it sacred in ancient Egypt. Beer was believed to be a gift from Osiris, the god of the afterlife. The workers who built the pyramids at Giza were not slaves. They were paid laborers, and part of their payment was beer. 4 to 5 liters per Dalton Y per worker. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built by men drinking beer for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Pharaohs were buried with jars of beer in their tombs, provisions for the afterlife. Beer was divine. But across the desert in Babylon, beer was becoming something else entirely. If Egypt treated beer like a sacred gift, Babylon treated it like a regulated commodity. The Code of Hammurabi, written around 1750 BCE, contains more than 20 laws dealing specifically with beer production and sale. Law 108. If a tavern keeper waters down the beer or overcharges customers, she shall be drowned, not fined. Drowned, the Babylonians classified beer into more than 20 types based on strength and quality. Beer had become a currency, used to pay wages, settle debts, and trade for goods. If Egypt made beer sacred, Babylon made it a business. Both were right. Then Rome fell. The Western Roman Empire crumbled over centuries. Roads decayed. Trade networks collapsed. Europe entered the Dark Ages. The Romans had always preferred wine. Beer was a barbarian drink. But in Northern Europe, Germania, Gaul, Britannia beer had always been the drink of choice. When Rome collapsed, you might assume beer making collapsed with it. It didn't. Christian monasteries became the unlikely saviors of beer. Monks had one very important theological justification. During Lent, the 40-day fasting period, monks couldn't eat solid food. But the rule of Saint Benedict made no mention of liquid. Liquid bread doesn't break the fast. They brewed thick, high-calorie beers that could sustain them through weeks of fasting. These weren't light drinks. They were nutrition in liquid form, sometimes exceeding 8% or 10% alcohol. But the monks didn't just brew for survival. They experimented. They discovered that adding hops, the flowers of the Humulus lupulus plant, did something extraordinary. Hops added bitterness and acted as a preservative. Beer brewed with hops could last for weeks, even months. Before the 12th century, beer spoiled quickly. The introduction of hops was revolutionary. Monasteries in Germany and Belgium became brewing powerhouses. The Trappist monks of Belgium still brew beer today, using methods that are hundreds of years old. Westwateren, Chimay, Orval, these are living traditions, unbroken chains stretching back to the Middle Ages. Rome had crumbled, cities had shrunk, trade had stopped. But beer did not disappear, because the monks believed one simple thing: liquid bread doesn't break the fast. On the 6th of September, 1620, the Mayflower set sail from England carrying 102 passengers. The cargo included barrels of salted meat, hardtack, and beer. Lots of beer. 2 months later, the ship made landfall at Plymouth. According to passenger William Bradford, they chose to land because our victuals being much spent, especially our beer. The Pilgrims decided where to establish one of the first European settlements in North America because they were running out of beer. On ocean voyages, fresh water turned stagnant within weeks. Beer stayed drinkable far longer. It was not about recreation. It was about survival. Beer crossed the Atlantic on every ship. Spanish, Dutch, French, and English colonists all brought brewing traditions to the New World. The first permanent structures built in many colonial towns were not churches. They were breweries. But beer was still handmade and local. Every town had its own brewers. Quality varied wildly. Distribution was limited. And then the 19th century arrived and everything changed. In the 1860s, French chemist Louis Pasteur discovered that heating wine to around 60 to 65 degrees Celsius killed bacteria without destroying flavor. This process, pasteurization, was quickly adopted by brewers. Before Pasteur, beer spoiled within weeks. Pasteurized beer could survive for months. It could be bottled, loaded onto trains, and shipped across countries. Pasteur didn't invent beer. He invented beer that could travel to the other side of the world. Then came Carl von Lindt. In 1876, this German engineer invented the first practical industrial refrigeration machine. Before this, beer could only be brewed during cooler months. Fermentation required low temperatures. Lindt's machine changed that overnight. Suddenly, you could brew beer in July. You could brew it in Texas, in India, anywhere. Winter was no longer the boss, engineers were. And then came the businessmen. In the 1880s, German immigrants like Adolphus Busch and Adolf Coors arrived in America, bringing Bavarian brewing traditions. They combined European techniques with American innovation, refrigerated rail cars, bottling technology, mass advertising. Anheuser, Busch introduced Budweiser in 1876. It was a pale lager, light-bodied and easy to drink, designed to appeal to everyone. It was consistent, cheap, and available everywhere. By the early 1900s, beer was an industry. Factories churned out thousands of barrels per Dalton Y. National brands dominated. Small breweries couldn't compete. Beer had been democratized. And for a while, that seemed like progress. Then, in 1920, the United States banned alcohol. The 18th Amendment made production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages illegal. Prohibition was supposed to reduce crime and improve public health. It did neither. Instead, it created a black market. Organized crime took over. Speakeasies opened everywhere, and thousands of breweries closed forever. When Prohibition ended in 1933, after 13 years, only the largest breweries could restart. Anheuser, Busch, Biller, these giants survived. The small breweries did not. By the 1950s, a dozen massive companies dominated American beer. They produced light lagers, pale, fizzy, nearly identical. Beer was everywhere. It was affordable. It was standardized. But something had been lost. Flavor, character, soul. Beer had become an industrial product designed not to be loved, but to be tolerated. For decades, This was just how beer was. But that didn't last. By the 1970s, something was brewing beneath the surface of American beer culture. Not literally thou that would come soon enough, but culturally. A generation of drinkers who had grown up on Budweiser and Coors began to travel. They visited Europe. They tasted beer in Germany, Belgium, England, and the Czech Republic. And they realized something unsettling. American beer tasted like nothing. It was cold, carbonated water with a faint whisper of grain and hops. It was designed to be consumed in mass quantities at baseball games and barbecues, not to be savored or enjoyed. It had no complexity, no character, no story. Food writers and culinary enthusiasts started asking an uncomfortable question. Why did the country that had industrialized beer more aggressively than any other produce some of the blandest beer on the planet? The answer was simple. Industrial brewing had optimized for consistency and cost, not flavor. Pasteurization killed wild microbes, but it also killed the nuanced flavors those microbes created. Refrigeration allowed year-round production, but it encouraged the use of adjuncts, cheap ingredients like corn and rice, to lighten the body and cut costs. Massive scale required standardization, and standardization meant eliminating anything unusual, interesting, or polarizing. For decades, this system went unchallenged. The big breweries controlled distribution, advertising, and shelf space. There was no room for alternatives. And then, in 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed a law that changed everything. He legalized home brewing. It sounds minor, but that single legislative act opened a door that had been sealed shut since Prohibition. Suddenly, ordinary Americans could legally brew beer in their garages, basements, and kitchens. They could experiment with recipes, try different ingredients, and rediscover styles that had been lost or forgotten. And some of them got really, really good at it. In 1965, long before homebrewing was legal, a man named Fritz Maytag bought a failing San Francisco brewery called Anchor Steam. It was one of the last remaining pre-Prohibition breweries in America, producing a unique style of beer that didn't fit into the pale lager mold that dominated the market. Maytag didn't try to make Anchor compete with Budweiser. He went the opposite direction. He focused on quality over quantity. He used traditional ingredients, 100% malted barley, whole hops, no adjuncts. He revived old brewing methods. He made beer that actually tasted like something. Anchor Steam became a cult favorite. It didn't outsell the big brands, but it didn't need to. It proved that there was a market for beer with flavor, character, and a story. Then came the homebrewers. In 1980, a homebrewer named Ken Grossman opened Sierra Nevada Brewing Company in Chico, California. His flagship beer, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, was a revelation. It was hoppy, bitter, aromatic, nothing like the bland lagers Americans were used to. Grossman used Cascade hops, an American variety that gave the beer a citrusy, piney character that was bold and unapologetic. People either loved it or hated it. There was no middle ground, and the people who loved it became evangelists. Around the same time, Jim Koch, a former management consultant with a family history in brewing, launched Samuel Adams' Boston Lager. He positioned it as a premium, full-flavored alternative to mass-market beer, and he backed it with aggressive marketing and distribution. Sam Adams brought craft beer into mainstream grocery stores and bars, making it accessible to drinkers who had never heard of Anchor or Sierra Nevada. The movement had begun. In 1980, there were only 89 breweries operating in the entire United States. By 1990, there were over 200, by 2000, over 1,500. By 2020, more than 8,000. This wasn't a trend, it was a renaissance. Small breweries, often called microbreweries or craft breweries, began popping up in every state, every city, every neighborhood. Former software engineers, teachers, firefighters, and accountants quit their jobs to open breweries. They brewed IPAs, stouts, porters, Belgian-style ales, sour beers, barrel-aged imperial stouts, styles that had been extinct in America for decades, or had never existed at all. They weren't trying to compete with Budweiser on price or volume. They were competing on flavor, creativity, and authenticity. and they were winning. But this wasn't just an American story. Around the world, beer was undergoing its own transformation. In Japan, a country with virtually no historical beer culture, beer consumption exploded in the late 20th century. Japanese brewers like Sapporo, Asahi, and Kirin dominated the market with crisp, clean lagers designed to pair with sushi, ramen, and grilled yakitori. But by the 2000s, Japanese craft breweries began experimenting with unique local ingredients, yuzu, matcha, sake yeast, creating fusion beers that blended Western brewing techniques with Japanese flavors. In Belgium, brewers who had been quietly maintaining medieval monastery traditions suddenly found themselves celebrated on the world stage. Trappist ales, lambics, saisons, and farmhouse ales, styles that had been brewed for centuries in small abbeys and family farms, became internationally sought after. Beer tourists traveled to Belgium specifically to visit obscure village breweries and drink beers that had barely changed in 500 years. In England, a movement called Camera, the campaign for real ale, fought to preserve traditional cask, conditioned ales in the face of industrial lager dominance. They succeeded. British pubs that had been on the verge of extinction became pilgrimage sites for beer lovers. In China, the world's largest beer market by volume, a new generation of urban consumers began turning away from mass-produced lagers like Tsingtao and snow beer. Craft breweries opened in Beijing, Shanghai, and Chengdu, brewing IPAs and stouts for young professionals who wanted something more than the watery lagers their parents drank. Beer had become a global language, spoken with 1,000 different accents. And then, in 2019, something happened that sent shockwaves through the global brewing community. The World Cheese Awards are a prestigious international competition held every 2 years, judging cheeses from across the globe. Wait, wrong script. The World Beer Cup, held every 2 years, is the most prestigious brewing competition on Earth. Thousands of beers from dozens of countries compete across more than 100 categories. Winning a medal can transform a small brewery overnight. But the real cultural earthquake came from smaller, regional competitions, where American craft breweries began consistently defeating European entries. Beers from Germany, Belgium, England, the Czech Republic, countries with centuries of brewing heritage. In competition after competition, beers from Vermont, Oregon, California, and Colorado took top honors. Judges, many of them European, were forced to admit that the Americans, who just 40 years earlier had been mocked for producing fizzy yellow water, were now brewing some of the most complex, well-crafted beers in the world. The country that had invented Budweiser and Coors Light, that had turned beer into an industrial commodity, had come full circle. America, the land of Bud Light and beer pong, had just become a brewing superpower. The irony was not lost on anyone. The real question about beer is not how it was discovered. That part was an accident. The question is, why did it endure? Why did this cloudy liquid born from a forgotten pot of grain 10,000 years ago outlast the civilizations that embraced it? Why did it survive the collapse of Sumer, the fall of Rome, the silence of the Dark Ages, the chaos of the Industrial Revolution, and even a 13-year ban in the world's largest economy? Why is beer still here, thriving, evolving, spreading to every corner of the planet, while empires that tried to control it have crumbled into dust? The answer comes in two parts. Beer, at its core, is a survival technology. For thousands of years before refrigeration, before water treatment plants, before modern sanitation, turning grain into beer was the only reliable way to create a safe, calorie-dense, portable source of nutrition that could last for weeks or months. It solved the water problem. Rivers and wells killed people. Beer didn't. It solved the storage problem. Fresh grain could rot or be eaten by pests. Fermented grain, sealed in a vessel, could feed a family through winter. It solved the energy problem. When meat was scarce and crops failed, beer provided the calories that kept laborers building pyramids, soldiers marching across continents, and monks surviving fasts. Beer was a tool before it was a tradition. It kept people alive. And when the survival pressure faded, when clean water became available, when refrigeration made fresh food accessible year-round, when global supply chains ensured that no one in the developed world ever truly starved, beer did not disappear, because somewhere along the way, beer had become something more than a preservation method. The crisp bitterness of a cold pilsner on a summer afternoon. The rich, roasted complexity of a stout by a winter fire. The bright citrus punch of a hazy IPA. The funky, sour tang of a Belgian lambic aged in oak barrels for 3 years. These are not survival strategies. These are experiences. And billions of people around the world choose them every single day. Not because they have to, but because they want to. But the other part of the answer is cultural. Beer is endlessly adaptable. Every region that adopted it made it their own. The Sumerians turned it into currency and divine offering. The Egyptians made it the fuel of monumentalism. The Babylonians regulated it like a utility. The medieval monks turned it into devotion and discipline. The Germans refined it into purity and precision. The Belgians made it wild, complex, and artistic. The British made it a social institution. The Americans industrialized it, commodified it, then tore it down and rebuilt it as a craft. Beer doesn't demand loyalty to a single tradition. It absorbs the character of wherever it lands. A Japanese lager tastes nothing like a Belgian Trappist ale. A German Pilsner shares no DNA with a New England IPA. A Nigerian palm wine beer has nothing in common with a Mexican lager served with lime. And yet all of them are beer. All of them are part of the same 10,000-year-old story. That is the secret of beer's immortality. It doesn't resist change. It embraces it. Somewhere right now, in a stone monastery in the hills of Belgium, a Trappist monk is checking the fermentation tanks, following a recipe that has been passed down, unbroken, for 700 years. He works in silence, the same silence his predecessors worked in, believing that brewing is a form of prayer. Somewhere in a basement in Munich, a lager is aging in near-freezing darkness, slowly developing the crisp, clean finish that has defined Bavarian beer for centuries. The brewmaster checks the temperature once a day, adjusts nothing, and waits. Patience is the only ingredient that matters now. Somewhere in a garage in Portland, Oregon, a former software engineer is experimenting with a recipe that has never been tried before. A sour ale aged in tequila barrels with hibiscus and ghost peppers. It might be terrible. It might be brilliant. Either way, it has never been done. Somewhere in a Tokyo izakaya, a salaryman orders his third beer of the night. A crisp Asahi super dry served so cold it hurts to drink. He has never heard of Ninkasi. He doesn't know what a monastery ale is. But he is part of the same tradition that started in a clay pot in Mesopotamia. Somewhere, in a Shanghai craft beer bar, a 25-year-old woman tastes her first IPA, wrinkles her nose at the bitterness, then takes another sip. In 6 months, she'll prefer it to anything else. In 2 years, she'll open her own brewery. Somewhere, in a factory that covers 10 acres of industrial parkland, machines are filling, capping, and labeling 2,000 bottles of beer per minute. It will be loaded onto trucks, shipped across continents, and consumed by people who will never know the name of the brewer or the story behind it. And that is fine. Because beer has always been for everyone. All of it, every sip, every style, every tradition and innovation, traces back to one forgotten pot in one ancient settlement, where rain fell, yeast landed, and fermentation happened without permission. That nameless forager who drank from the pot 10,000 years ago would not recognize a modern IPA. They would not understand pasteurization, refrigeration, or hop contracts. They would be baffled by the fact that people argue passionately about beer on the internet, that competitions award medals for it, that entire economies are built around it. But they would recognize one thing, the feeling, that first sip, the warmth, the lightness. The sense that the world, for just a moment, is a little bit softer, a little bit kinder, a little bit more forgiving. That feeling hasn't changed in 10,000 years. And as long as humans exist, it never will.